Tensions are heating up in Washington this hour. Some U.S. lawmakers want Canada to sign a deal soon, while Canada insists it won't be forced into a rush agreement on NAFTA. Negotiators are working against an October 1st deadline. That's when the U.S. is slated to send the text of its deal with Mexico to Congress. So where do talks stand right now? The CBC's Katie Simpson is standing by. She joins us from outside the U.S. Trade Representative's office. Hey, Katie, thanks for being with us. What's happening there?
Something very funny actually just happened, Vashi. A couple of Canadians on rental bikes just walked by with their bikes and said, "Go, Freeland, go." So they knew exactly what's going on here at the Red Bricks in front of the U.S. Trade Representative's office. And they walked, I said, obviously you're clearly Canadian. They go, "Yay," and then kept on going. But in terms of what's actually happening inside of the room, so far there are no signs of any significant breakthroughs at this point. Talks are being described by the Foreign Affairs Minister as intense, and that's exactly what she told reporters about the marathon sessions that are happening behind the scenes.
We are working extremely hard and have been for the past 13 months. We've been engaged in a very intensive negotiation, something Ambassador Lighthizer calls a continuous negotiation, over the past 4 weeks. Our negotiators have been really hard at it, including an all-night session last night of one team that just ended at 7 a.m. this morning.
So negotiators had a marathon overnight session trying to get closer to a breakthrough. So far, there's no signs emerging yet. There's been any massive movement in terms of the position from Canada, in terms of the position from the U.S. Of course, Vashi, as we know, the Americans and Mexicans, they are ramping up pressure on Canada to try and get the Canadians to sign on to a deal before October 1st. And today, a very influential American lawmaker, a man named Kevin Brady, who is the chair of an influential committee called the Ways and Means Committee, he issued a direct warning to Canada.
Look, Canada needs to really step up here this week. We're not going to change the deadlines. Republicans in the new trade rules, we opened up the process to the public. We made it more deliberate. We're going to stay with that timetable.
So clearly that's another voice piling on to Canada to say, hey, get it, fall in line or else there'll be consequences.
And what about Ontario Premier Doug Ford? I know he's in Washington for an in-person update on the talks. What happened there?
That's certainly the wild card of today's NAFTA negotiations. Doug Ford has been very public in his support for Canadian NAFTA negotiators. Of course, there's a lot on the line for Ontario, particularly in the manufacturing sector. So premiers across the country have been very encouraging and very supportive of the Canadian negotiators, and Doug Ford repeated his support today after an in-person briefing with the Canadian negotiators over at the Canadian Embassy.
Province of Ontario is standing shoulder to shoulder with our federal government, and we're going to get this deal done hopefully sooner than later. But they're doing a great job. They worked all night last night, and I want to congratulate them for the hard work they're doing. But I can reassure that Ontario and Canada is united when it comes to NAFTA.
So that is very much what the Canadian negotiators wanted to hear. If there's any sort of difference between what someone like Doug Ford or someone else who is heavily influential in Canadian politics, if they said something that contradicted the Canadian position, it could be seen as giving the Americans some support, some leverage in terms of their negotiating position. So that is exactly what the Canadians wanted to hear publicly out of Doug Ford today.
All right, thanks, Katie. Katie Simpson in Washington. So what is the Ontario government expecting from today's debrief, and what message do they have for their federal counterparts? Earlier today, I spoke with Ontario's Minister of Economic Development, Jim Wilson, who's in Washington with Premier Ford. Hi, Minister. Thanks so much for being with us. I want to, of course, talk to you about the reason you're in Washington, but I have to start with the news of the day, the stay, I should say, the Court of Appeal essentially giving your government the green light to proceed with cuts to Toronto City Council. Why didn't you just wait for this decision instead of using the notwithstanding clause?
Well, we wanted to make sure that we were ready for October 22nd and that we'd have a 25-member council, and we wanted to use every tool in the toolbox to do that. And very pleased with the Court of Appeal's decision today to stay. And we're now back to the original Bill 5. That's now the law. And, we're working with the City Clerk, Elections Ontario, is working with Toronto to make sure we'll have fair elections on October 22nd. I think it's good news for the people of Toronto. It helps break gridlock on that council, and you can get down to the issues that mean a great deal to everybody in Toronto. It's transit and infrastructure and all the stuff that needs to be done that hasn't been done over the years.
But using the notwithstanding clause created so much controversy. There was a lot of backlash and confusion that ensued. Do you regret causing all of that when you could have just gone through the courts?
Well, I think we needed to. We needed to make sure we used all the tools available to legislators. I've been there 28 years. I was very comfortable moving forward with the notwithstanding clause. I understand the Constitution very well, and we are actually upholding the Constitution by using Section 31, 33 of the Constitution. So, you know, as a legislator, you do what you have to do to get the job done, and very pleased with the Court of Appeal decision. We thought that the original justice, his decision was wrong, and we actually did a favor for all parliamentarians in the Commonwealth Westminster system to indicate that Parliament is supreme, and Parliament has tools in the Charter of Rights and Freedom that if we think we're right and maybe the judge made an error, that we can go ahead and do that. Now it's not permanent law. It's only suspended his decision for 5 years, but we hope the Court of Appeal will settle things down, and you know, now it's good. We have certainty for the people of Toronto. We're going to have a fair election on October 22nd, working with the city to make sure that happens, and all good as far as from a legislative point of view.
But again, why go through all of that, use that clause, when in the end you're relying on the legal system, a system you were also decrying last week?
Yeah, but the notwithstanding clause is a tool that's available to legislators, and I think there was a real overreaction and people not understanding that we were using the Constitution to uphold the Constitution. I was very comfortable with that.
Okay, on to NAFTA and your visit to Washington. Yesterday, Premier Ford insisted Ontario farming jobs can't be used as a, quote, bargaining chip. But President Trump obviously seems to be fixated on Canadian dairy subsidies. Would you accept some concessions on supply management?
Well, you know, I've promised the federal government and Minister Freeland that we wouldn't negotiate the details in public, but we're here today to remind...
Really, though, Minister, why would Premier Ford publicly say yesterday that farming jobs can't be used as bargaining chips? Publicly.
Well, we're here today. We're here today in Washington to indicate to our federal counterparts that we remain standing shoulder to shoulder with them to get a deal on NAFTA, that we need a deal on NAFTA. And the sectors we're talking to our negotiators about today are steel and aluminum, because of the tariffs that President Trump has put in those sectors, agriculture and automotive. We want to make sure that the federal government stands up for Ontario jobs. That's something I do every day. That's something the Premier does every day. And we want to make sure that's reflected in a modernized NAFTA.
On agriculture, what did the Premier mean when he said farming jobs can't be used as bargaining chips?
He meant we're standing up for the agriculture sector and supply management. And that's our job, right?
I want to be clear, though. Does that mean no concessions?
Well, it's our job to stick up for them, and we'll see what the federal government does. We're here, having face-to-face meetings today, high-level meetings, and obviously the Premier's here to indicate that we're quite serious about sticking up for the agricultural jobs, automotive jobs, steel and aluminum. You know, there's about 1 million jobs at stake in the province of Ontario, and about 9 million jobs at stake directly should NAFTA fail and retaliatory tariffs be brought in, or if President Trump were to move ahead with more of these Section 232 tariffs that he's put on steel and aluminum. If that were done in the automotive sector, we'd lose an additional 1 million jobs. So fact of the matter is, good to be here in person, standing up for Ontario jobs. Premier's brought it to the highest level now. And we've had an excellent meeting this morning with Ambassador McNaughton and his people. And we'll be doing a working lunch with also the Ambassador of the United States and Ambassador McNaughton. Minister Freeland will join us. And it's great to see people face to face and have these discussions.
Okay, I understand, Minister, but with respect, that doesn't answer my question. Is your government's message to the federal government no concessions on supply management?
Well, again, with the details, we don't discuss in public, and we've committed to the federal government we wouldn't do that. But we just wanted to emphasize today that supply management is very, very important. And whatever they do in that sector, it has to reflect the needs and the wishes and of Ontario workers, Ontario farmers, and that's our message today.
I want to ask about those meetings you mentioned. You listed off the ambassadors and Canadian officials. Are you meeting with any American officials?
Not at this time. We're standing side by side with the federal government. It's their job and their jurisdiction to get a deal on NAFTA. We're just reminding them that there's some sectors that we're concerned about, and we want to make sure Ontario jobs are protected and we can grow jobs in the future. And a message, you know, we've been just doing roundtables with businesses, several of them over the last couple of months, and they want a deal done, but it wouldn't be a deal at all costs, and so we're discussing all of that with the federal government also.
Really, though, no American officials? We, of course, saw, and I asked because we saw the letter yesterday from Steve Scalise, of course, the majority whip in the House, essentially saying to Canada, we're not going to have your back if this goes through Congress, and in the end, we are pursuing a bilateral deal with Mexico. Would it not have been worth meeting with American officials?
Well, as you know, I was down here in July and I met with American lawmakers, both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican. I also met with a number of associations representing auto and manufacturing in the U.S. We met with U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So we've had a few rounds of those. That was the most public round, and I'm on the phone, as the Premier is, constantly with U.S. people. The Premier's, I think, contacted at least, got good relations now with at least 10 governors, reminding...
But not on this trip. Didn't the Premier want to meet with U.S. officials?
That wasn't the purpose of the trip here today. The purpose is to meet with our officials face-to-face. I hadn't met a lot of these people face-to-face, and the Premier hadn't had the opportunity to do that. We do talk to the federal government regularly. Our officials work together, but it was time to bring it up to the Premier's level to say, look, we're serious about standing up for jobs in Ontario, and we hope you are too. And, you know, the reception we got today and the meetings we've had so far, very, very positive.
I take your point, but aren't those officials people you could have met in Canada? I mean, your government has made value for taxpayer money a central tenet. Is this really the best use of it? Is a trip like this the best use?
Yeah, I think it is important to see people face to face and to understand the nuances that occur during conversations when you're in person. You know, Minister Freeland travels quite frequently, and she had a good line last week when she was asked a similar question. She said some things are best done in person, and that's the case today.
Okay, I have to leave it there. Thanks so much, Minister.
Okay, thank you, Vashi.